The most dangerous trap in life is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge, because the moment you believe you already know enough is the moment you stop growing. And that is exactly where Ethan Carter found himself at 28 years old, sitting in a small, dim office cubicle that measured barely 6 feet by 6 feet, staring at a flickering computer screen that hadn't changed much in the last 3 years of his life. Even though he always told himself he was smarter than the people around him, even though he believed he deserved more, a better job, a better life, a better future, yet somehow nothing ever moved forward. Every morning he would wake up in his one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, grab a quick cup of coffee, and scroll through his phone, watching people he used to know back in college posting pictures of new houses, road trips across states, promotions, and small wins that seemed to add up into a life he didn't have. And every time he saw those posts, a quiet voice inside him would whisper something uncomfortable. But Ethan had learned how to silence that voice quickly, replacing it with a familiar thought. They just got lucky. They're not smarter than me. I already know what they know. I just haven't had the right opportunity yet. And that belief became his shield, a shield that protected his ego but slowly trapped his potential. Because whenever his manager tried to give him feedback, Ethan would nod without really listening, thinking I've heard this before. When coworkers shared ideas, he would dismiss them in his mind before they even finished speaking, thinking I already know that. When he watched videos or read articles about improving skills, building discipline, or changing habits, he would close them halfway through, convinced there was nothing new to learn. And over time something strange began to happen. While Ethan stayed exactly where he was, the world around him kept moving forward. People he once considered average started getting ahead. Not because they were more talented, not because they were more gifted, but because they were willing to admit something Ethan never could, that they didn't know everything. And one quiet evening, as the office lights dimmed and most of his coworkers had already left, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked around, noticing how empty the room felt, how quiet his life had become, and for a brief moment, that small voice returned, stronger this time, asking a question he couldn't ignore as easily as before. If you already know so much, then why are you still here? The most dangerous trap in life is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge, because the moment you believe you already know enough is the moment you stop growing. And that is exactly where Ethan Carter found himself at 28 years old, sitting in a small, dim office cubicle that measured barely 6 feet by 6 feet, staring at a flickering computer screen that hadn't changed much in the last 3 years of his life. Even though he always told himself he was smarter than the people around him, even though he believed he deserved more, a better job, a better life, a better future, yet somehow nothing ever moved forward. Every morning he would wake up in his one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, grab a quick cup of coffee, and scroll through his phone, watching people he used to know back in college posting pictures of new houses, road trips across states, promotions, and small wins that seemed to add up into a life he didn't have. And every time he saw those posts, a quiet voice inside him would whisper something uncomfortable. But Ethan had learned how to silence that voice quickly, replacing it with a familiar thought. They just got lucky. They're not smarter than me. I already know what they know. I just haven't had the right opportunity yet. And that belief became his shield, a shield that protected his ego but slowly trapped his potential. Because whenever his manager tried to give him feedback, Ethan would nod without really listening, thinking I've heard this before. When coworkers shared ideas, he would dismiss them in his mind before they even finished speaking, thinking I already know that. When he watched videos or read articles about improving skills, building discipline, or changing habits, he would close them halfway through, convinced there was nothing new to learn. And over time something strange began to happen. While Ethan stayed exactly where he was, the world around him kept moving forward. People he once considered average started getting ahead, not because they were more talented, not because they were more gifted, but because they were willing to admit something Ethan never could, that they didn't know everything. And one quiet evening, as the office lights dimmed and most of his coworkers had already left, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked around, noticing how empty the room felt, how quiet his life had become. And for a brief moment, that small voice returned, stronger this time, asking a question he couldn't ignore as easily as before. If you already know so much, Then why are you still here that night? Ethan could not shake the feeling that something inside him had started to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like a quiet shift he could not fully explain. And instead of turning on the television like he usually did, he sat in silence in his small living room, replaying moments from his past that he had never questioned before, conversations where people had tried to help him, feedback he had brushed aside, chances he had ignored because he believed he already understood enough. And as those memories surfaced one by one, a pattern began to form, subtle but undeniable. He had not been learning. He had been defending his ideas, his habits, his identity as someone who was already capable. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable it became, because it meant that every time he said, "I already know," he was not just closing a conversation, he was closing a door. And the next day, that realization followed him back to work. But this time something was different. Instead of automatically dismissing what he heard, he started to notice how quickly his mind wanted to react, how fast it tried to interrupt, to judge, to conclude before fully understanding. And for the first time, he caught himself in that moment. Just for a second, during a conversation with his manager, when new instructions were being explained, Ethan felt the familiar urge rise inside him, the quiet thought saying, "This is basic. I know this already." But instead of letting that thought take control, he paused, not long, just enough to create a small gap. And in that gap, something new happened. He listened, not perfectly, not completely, but more than he ever had before. And even though the information was not entirely new, he began to notice details he had missed, small adjustments, different perspectives, things that could actually change how he worked, and it surprised him. Not because it was complex, but because it revealed something simple, that knowing something is not the same as understanding it, and understanding it is not the same as applying it. And as the day went on, Ethan continued to test this small shift, catching his reactions, holding back his assumptions, letting people finish their thoughts before deciding whether he agreed or not. And each time he did, he felt a strange mix of discomfort and clarity. Discomfort because it challenged his proof of always being certain, and clarity because it opened space for something new to enter. And by the end of the day, Ethan realized something that made him both uneasy and curious. Maybe the biggest thing he had been protecting all along was not his knowledge, but his pride. And if that was true, then letting go of that pride, even a little, might be the first real step forward. Over the next few days, Ethan continued this quiet experiment, not telling anyone, not making any big announcements, just observing himself more closely than ever before. And what he noticed was not comfortable. Every time someone spoke, his mind still rushed to conclusions. Every time he heard advice, a voice inside him still whispered that he already knew it. And sometimes that voice was so strong that he almost gave in, almost returned to his old way of thinking. But now there was another voice, smaller but growing, asking him to wait just a little longer, to listen just a little deeper. And that internal tension became his daily struggle, not with the world, but with himself. And one afternoon, that struggle reached a turning point when his manager assigned a new project, something slightly outside his usual responsibilities, something that required learning a new system, a new way of thinking. And as the instructions were explained, Ethan felt that familiar reaction rise again, the urge to simplify it, to assume it was easy, to believe he could figure it out without fully paying attention. But this time he paused longer than before, forcing himself to stay present, to write things down, to ask one simple question, something he would have never done in the past, because he believed it would make him look less capable. And to his surprise, the response he received was not judgment, but clarity. The explanation filled in gaps he did not even realize existed. And for the first time, Ethan experienced something new, not just hearing information, but actually understanding it at a deeper level. And as he worked on the project later that day, he noticed something even more surprising. He made fewer mistakes. He moved more confidently, and the process felt smoother, not because he suddenly became more intelligent, but because he had finally allowed himself to learn instead of assume. And that small shift created a quiet but powerful realization that the effort he had spent protecting his image as someone who already knew everything had actually been holding him back, and that letting go of that image, even slightly, was giving him access to something he had been missing for years, real growth. And as Ethan sat at his desk reviewing his progress, he felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because he was finally moving forward, and unease because he began to wonder how many opportunities he had lost in the past simply because he refused to admit that he did not know enough. As the days turned into a week, Ethan began to notice that this small shift in his behavior was creating changes he could not ignore. Not dramatic changes, not instant success, but steady progress that felt real. And for the first time in a long time, he was not just going through the motions at work, he was actually improving. Tasks that once felt repetitive now revealed new layers. Conversations that once seemed pointless now carried insights he had previously overlooked, and even his co-workers started to respond to him differently. Not because he had become more talkative, but because he had become more present, more open. And yet with every step forward came a deeper realization that was harder to face. Because the more he learned, the more he saw how much he had missed before. How many times he had been given the same advice in different forms and ignored it. How many chances he had to grow but chose comfort instead. And that awareness began to weigh on him, not in a way that stopped him, but in a way that made him reflect more honestly than ever. And one evening after work, Ethan decided to take a different route home. Driving slowly through streets he had passed countless times but never really noticed. And he found himself thinking about the past, not with regret alone, but with a new kind of clarity, understanding that his biggest limitation had never been a lack of opportunity, but a refusal to see beyond his own assumptions. And as he stopped at a red light, he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and asked himself a question he had avoided for years. How many times did I choose to feel right instead of choosing to grow? And the answer did not come in words, but in memories, small moments where he dismissed feedback, ignored advice, or shut down new ideas before they had a chance to take root. And in that moment, Ethan realized something that felt both simple and profound. That growth does not begin when you learn something new. It begins when you admit that you do not know enough. And as the light turned green and he continued driving, he felt a quiet shift inside him. Not a sudden transformation, but a deeper commitment forming, a decision to keep questioning, to keep listening, and to keep challenging the part of himself that wanted to stay comfortable. Because now he understood that the real battle was not against the world around him, but against the version of himself that believed it already had all the answers. The following week brought a challenge Ethan could not avoid, a situation that would test whether his new awareness was real or just temporary, because his manager announced that the team would be evaluated for a potential promotion. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a quiet sense of anticipation mixed with doubt, not because he did not want the opportunity, but because he was no longer certain he was as prepared as he once believed. And that uncertainty, instead of weakening him, pushed him to approach things differently. He began reviewing his past work more carefully, noticing small mistakes he would have ignored before, patterns in his behavior that had limited his performance. And instead of brushing them aside, he took the time to understand them, to ask why they happened and what he could do differently. And during one of those moments, Daniel sat beside him and shared a few suggestions, simple adjustments that could improve efficiency. And as Ethan listened, he felt that familiar resistance rise again, the urge to say, "I know this already," but this time he caught it faster, holding it back, choosing instead to ask one follow-up question, and then another, and with each question, the conversation deepened, revealing insights that went beyond what Ethan had previously understood, and something important began to shift, not just in his actions, but in how he saw himself. Because for years he had defined himself as someone who already had answers, someone who did not need guidance. But now he was starting to see the strength in not knowing, in being open, in being willing to look uncertain for the sake of growth. And as the evaluation day approached, Ethan found himself preparing in a way he never had before, not by relying on what he thought he knew, but by actively seeking what he did not know, reviewing feedback, practicing new approaches, and paying attention to details he once ignored. And when the day finally came, he walked into the evaluation room not with the same confidence he used to carry, but with something different, something quieter but stronger, a willingness to learn in real time, to adapt, to listen. And during the process he noticed something unexpected. He was thinking more clearly, responding more thoughtfully, and handling challenges with more awareness, not because he had suddenly become more capable overnight, but because he was no longer blocking himself with the belief that he already knew everything. And as he walked out of the room, he did not feel the need to immediately judge his performance. He did not rush to conclusions or assumptions. Instead, he simply acknowledged that he had done something different, something better, and for the first time he began to understand that progress is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is a quiet shift in how you see yourself, and how willing you are to let go of what you think you know in order to discover what you truly need to learn. The days after the evaluation felt different, not because Ethan had received immediate results, but because something inside him had shifted in a way he could not ignore. And for the first time, he was not obsessing over whether he had done better than others. Instead, he found himself thinking about how much he had changed compared to who he was just weeks ago. And that thought stayed with him as he continued his routine, arriving at work, sitting at his desk, opening his laptop. But now every action carried a new awareness. Every task became an opportunity to observe, to adjust, to improve. And slowly the people around him began to notice, not in a dramatic way, but in small reactions. His manager started giving him more responsibility. Daniel began asking for his input during discussions. And even casual conversations felt more meaningful because Ethan was no longer waiting for his turn to speak. He was actually listening, and that simple change created a quiet confidence that felt different from anything he had experienced before. It was not built on proving himself right, but on being willing to grow. And one afternoon his manager called him into the office, a place that used to make him feel defensive. But this time he walked in calm, open, and ready to hear whatever was said. And as they sat across from each other, his manager spoke honestly, acknowledging the improvement, pointing out the difference in his attitude, his effort, and his willingness to learn. And then came the words Ethan had been waiting for. He was being considered for a new role, one that offered more responsibility and a higher salary. And for a brief moment, Ethan felt a surge of excitement. But what surprised him most was what followed. Instead of immediately assuming he deserved it, instead of telling himself he had always been capable, he paused, taking in the moment with a sense of humility, recognizing that this opportunity was not something he had been entitled to. It was something he had grown into. And as he left the office that day, walking through the same hallway he had passed countless times before, everything felt slightly different, not because the building had changed, but because he had. And yet, as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, a new question quietly formed in his mind. If letting go of what I thought I knew could change this much, then how much more is still waiting for me to discover? That night, Ethan sat by his window looking out at the quiet city lights, holding on to that question that had begun to reshape everything inside him. And for the first time, he did not rush to answer it. He simply let it stay, letting it grow, because he was starting to understand that the real value was not in having answers, but in asking better questions. And as he reflected on the past few weeks, he saw his journey more clearly than ever before, not as a sudden success story, but as a gradual awakening, a slow breaking down of a belief he had carried for years without questioning, the belief that he already knew enough. And now that belief felt smaller, weaker, almost fragile, as if it could disappear at any moment if he stopped feeding it. And in its place, something new had begun to take form, something quieter but far more powerful. A mindset that allowed him to see opportunities instead of dismiss them, to hear lessons instead of ignoring them, to grow instead of staying the same. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his life had not changed because the world suddenly became easier. It had changed because he had stopped resisting it. He had stopped trying to prove himself right and started allowing himself to be wrong. And that simple shift had opened doors he never even noticed before. And the next morning, as Ethan walked into the office, everything felt familiar yet different. The same desks, the same people, the same routine, but now each moment carried potential. Every conversation held something to learn. Every challenge felt like an opportunity instead of a threat. And as he sat down at his desk and began his work, he noticed how naturally his new approach was becoming part of him. No longer forced, no longer something he had to remind himself to do, but something that was starting to define how he thought and acted. And yet deep inside he knew this was only the beginning, because with every layer he uncovered, there were more layers beneath it, more assumptions to question, more habits to reshape. And that realization did not overwhelm him, it motivated him, because now he understood that growth was not a destination. It was a continuous process, one that required humility, awareness, and the courage to admit that there is always more to learn. And as Ethan looked around the office, watching others go about their day, he quietly wondered. How many of them were still trapped in the same illusion he had just begun to escape? And how many opportunities were being missed not because of a lack of ability, but because of a refusal to see beyond what they believed they already knew? Weeks turned into months, and the quiet transformation within Ethan continued to unfold, not as a dramatic change that others could easily point out, but as a steady evolution in how he saw the world and his place in it. And with each passing day he became more aware of a simple truth that had once been invisible to him, that the moment you believe you have reached a point where there is nothing left to learn is the moment you begin to fall behind. And this realization no longer felt like a painful truth. It felt like a guide, something that kept him grounded and open at the same time. And as he settled into his new role with greater responsibility, he faced new challenges that would have overwhelmed the version of himself from before. But now, instead of reacting with frustration or pretending to understand, he approached each situation with curiosity, asking questions, seeking feedback, and allowing himself to grow through the process. And one afternoon, as he worked through a complex problem, he paused and smiled quietly, remembering the man he used to be, the one who would have rushed to conclusions, who would have insisted on being right even when the results said otherwise. And that memory no longer brought discomfort, it brought clarity, because it showed him how far he had come, not in terms of position or salary, but in mindset. And later that evening, as he walked out of the office building, the cool air brushing against his face, he realized something deeper than before, that success is not built on how much you know, but on how willing you are to keep learning, and that every step forward in his life had come from letting go of certainty and choosing awareness instead. And as he stood there for a moment, looking at the city moving around him, he understood that there would always be more to learn, more to question, more to discover. And that was not something to fear, it was something to embrace, because the real difference between staying stuck and moving forward is not intelligence. It is humility, the willingness to admit that you do not have all the answers. And as Ethan walked toward his car, a final thought settled clearly in his mind, simple yet powerful. The day you stop thinking you know everything is the day your life truly begins to change.